The ship was dying, and Mara Osei knew it. She could feel it in the way the flight controls shook under her hands. She could feel it in the way every warning light on the dash had gone red. She could feel it in the sound the engines were making, a sound that had gone from a strong roar to a broken, horrible scream. The Cassidy's Reach was a long-range UNAF scout ship, built to survive deep space, built to handle the worst that the universe could throw at her. But nobody had built her to survive a debris strike that took out 2 engines at once. Mara pulled at the controls with everything she had. She tried every override, punched every emergency button, called out commands to the ship's AI that were already useless because half the AI was gone too. The moon below was green and gray and wild. She could see it through the cracked cockpit glass, getting bigger and bigger every second. She had maybe 40 seconds before impact. Tried to reach the rest of the crew. Static. She tried the beacon. Dead. She tried the secondary engines. Nothing. So she did the only thing left to do. She ejected. The seat fired her out into open air with a force that made her chest feel like it was caving in. She heard the ship go down behind her, heard the explosion shake the air, and then the parachute opened, and the jungle came up fast, and she hit the ground hard, and everything went black. She woke up with mud in her mouth, and a sound in her ears that she could not name right away. It was rain. Alien rain. Warm and thick, falling through a canopy of trees that were nothing like any trees she had ever seen. They were tall and dark, with bark the color of old ash, and the leaves were wide and flat and almost black at the edges. She lay still for a moment and tried to remember how to breathe. Her left arm was wrong. She knew that immediately, which was bad, but from the angle of it, which was worse. Broken somewhere between the elbow and the wrist. She sat up slowly and looked around. The crash site was maybe 200 meters ahead of her. She could see the smoke rising through the trees, could smell burning metal and something chemical that made her eyes water. Her survival kit was strapped to her side, half crushed, the hard case dented and cracked. She unclipped it with her good arm and opened it. The emergency beacon was smashed completely. The food supply had been reduced to 2 protein bars and a handful of nutrition tablets. The medical kit was partially intact, which was something. She took stock of herself. Broken arm, bruised ribs, a cut along her jaw that had already started to clot. She was alive. She stood up, tucked her broken arm against her chest, and walked toward the wreckage. She was not looking for survivors. She knew there were none. Seen the state of the ship on the way down. Had watched whole sections of it break away before she ejected. She was looking for anything she could use. She moved through the outer edge of the debris field. Pieces of hull, snapped cables, torn panels. The heat from the burning core section pushed back against her face. She had already started making a mental list. Wire, insulation, anything sealed and watertight, anything with a power cell, when she heard a sound. It was very small. It was not the sound of fire or rain or metal cooling in the wet air. It was the sound of something breathing, short and fast and frightened, coming from underneath a section of collapsed hull plating about 10 meters to her left. She stopped. She listened. The breathing was still there, small and quick and desperate. She moved toward it without thinking, her broken arm screaming at her as she dropped to her knees beside the hull plate. Felt around the edges with her good hand. The plate was heavy. She could tell that immediately. It had landed at a slight angle, resting against a broken strut, which meant there was a gap underneath. She pressed her ear to the gap. The breathing was closer now. Something was underneath that plate, small and alive, and it was struggling. Mara Osei stood up, set her feet, grabbed the edge of the plate with her right hand, pressed her broken left arm against her ribs to brace herself, and pulled. The pain was extraordinary. It came up her arm and through her shoulder, and she made a sound she had never heard herself make before. A low, ragged noise that she pushed through, kept pushing through, because the breathing was still there, and it needed her to be stronger than the pain. The plate shifted, 1 inch, 2 inches. She dropped lower and pushed upward with her whole body, and the plate ground against the strut and tilted and fell away. with a crash that scattered mud in every direction. She fell with it, landing hard on her right side. She lay there for a second, breathing. Then she rolled over and looked. There was a child underneath. Not a human child. It was small, maybe the size of a human 7-year-old, with gray skin the color of pale stone, and 6 fingers on each hand, and eyes that were very large and very dark, and currently looking at her with absolute terror. Its ears were flat against the sides of its head. Its body was pulled in tight, curled like it was trying to become as small as possible. It had a cut across its forehead, and its left leg was pinned at an angle that looked painful. Mara had heard of the Thorathi. Everybody in UNAF had, at least in passing, a quiet, intelligent species, peaceful navigators and scholars, who had been charting the galaxy long before humans first left their own system. She had never seen one in person. Definitely never expected to find one underneath a crashed hull plate on an uncharted moon. The child was staring at her and shaking. Mara made herself slow down, made herself stop moving the way she had been moving, which was fast and driven by adrenaline. She sat back on her heels and lowered her body and kept her hands where the child could see them. She did not move toward it. She did not speak. She kept her face calm. She made her breathing slow and deliberate. And then, because she could not think of anything else to do, she smiled. Not a big smile, not the kind that showed too many teeth. Just a small, quiet smile, the kind her mother had used on her as a little girl when something was frightening and someone needed to say without words that things were going to be okay. The child stared at her for a long moment. Then the shaking slowed, just slightly, and it made a small sound, low and clicking, that Mara could not interpret, but chose to take as a good sign. She freed its leg gently, checking it as best she could. Bruised, not broken, lucky. Then she sat back down in the mud, in the alien rain, and opened her survival kit with one hand. She broke the first protein bar in half, slowly, so the child could see what she was doing. And she set one half on the mud between them, within reach, and took the other half herself, and ate it. The child watched her. A long moment passed. Then it reached out, 6 gray fingers, careful as anything, and picked up the half bar and held it. It did not eat it yet. It just held it and looked at her. Mara nodded. The rain came down warm and strange around them, and the wreck smoked quietly in the trees behind them, and 2 creatures from opposite ends of the galaxy sat in the mud together and shared a protein bar. And that was how it started. Mara did not know this on day 1, or day 2, or even day 5. She did not know it until day 8, when she pointed at herself and said her own name slowly and clearly, and then pointed at him and raised her eyebrows in a question. He looked at her for a moment, the way he always looked at her, with those large, dark eyes that seemed to be absorbing and processing everything at once, and then he made a sound. It was short and soft, and had a small click at the end, something like Ven, but not quite, something her mouth was not built to copy exactly. But she tried, and whatever sound she made must have been close enough, because he blinked and then did something she had not seen him do before. He tilted his head to one side. She decided that meant yes. She pointed at herself again and said, Mara. He tried it. It came out as something between Mara and Maha. And she nodded and said good. And he did. The head tilt again. That was their first real conversation, and it took them 8 days to get there. The first 30 days on Kareth 9 were the hardest days of Mara Osei's life. And she had lived through things that most people would not believe. She had ejected from a burning aircraft over the coast of Iceland during a training exercise gone wrong. She had spent 4 days lost in the Namib Desert after a navigation failure on a solo long-range flight. She had watched 2 crewmates die during a deep space engine failure 3 years ago, and held it together long enough to get the rest of the crew home. But those things had been shorter, or she had known rescue was possible, or she had been surrounded by people who shared her language and her training. None of that was true here. The first thing she had to do was her arm. She did it on day 2, because waiting would only make it worse. She sat with her back against a tree root, and used a strip of hull plating she had bent into a rough splint shape, and wound wire around it, tight, until her arm was as straight and as still as she could make it. She did not do this quietly. She made a sound that started as a grunt and became something louder, something she was not proud of, something that came from a place below dignity. And then she breathed through it and finished wrapping the wire and sat very still for a while. Ven sat across from her the entire time. He did not look away. When it was over and she looked up at him, he was staring at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not pity exactly, not horror exactly. Something more like the look of a person who has just seen a thing they cannot explain, and is trying very hard to find a category for it. She managed a weak thumbs up with her good hand. He stared at the thumb. She would explain thumbs up later. Communication in those first weeks was slow and sometimes maddening. Mara started building a gesture system on day 3, pointing at things and naming them, acting out actions so he could learn the words, using her face to show meaning when her hands could not, and then picked it up faster than she had any right to expect. By the end of the first week he had learned around a dozen of her hand signs, and was watching her face constantly for information. She learned quickly that Tharathi communicated a great deal through the position of their ears and the tilt of their head, and she started watching those things the way she had once watched instruments on a cockpit panel. He was teaching her too, even if neither of them had framed it that way. On day 4 he stopped her from picking a cluster of orange-brown fruit off a low tree by grabbing her wrist, gently, careful of her bad arm, and shaking his head and making a sharp sound she had not heard him make before. He bent down and found a dead insect near the base of the tree, held it up for her to see, and pointed at the fruit. The insects near that tree were dead. She put the fruit down. On day 6 he led her to a different plant entirely, low with dark green leaves and small purple pods, and showed her how to press the pods until they split and revealed the seeds inside, which were nutty and slightly sweet and completely edible. He seemed to know, by smell or touch or some instinct she did not have, which things on this moon were safe and which things were not. She brought the engineering and the building and the traps. He brought the knowledge of the world they were trapped in. Together they managed. The shelter was Mara's work, built in a single sleepless night on day 3 out of hull plating and bent struts and broad dark leaves, layered like tiles against the rain. It was not beautiful, but it was solid, and it kept the water out, and it was large enough for both of them. Then watched her build it, with his head tilted almost constantly, which she had started to understand meant he was deeply interested in something. The traps came later, simple ones at first, weight and drop designs she remembered from a survival training course, and they caught small 6-legged creatures that looked nothing like anything on Earth, but tasted, when roasted over a small fire, something like tough chicken. Ven had initially refused to eat the first one she cooked. She did not blame him. She was fairly sure it was against something in his culture, or at least very far outside his normal experience. But on day 9, when he was genuinely hungry and the cooked creature was the only thing available, he tried it. He chewed for a very long time. Then he did the head tilt. She counted that as a win. But the stalker was the real crisis of those first 30 days. She named it the stalker because that was what it did. It was 6-legged and roughly the size of a large horse, with a flat, wide head and no visible eyes, and it moved through the trees around their camp at a distance, never approaching, never retreating, just present, watching, or whatever it did instead of watching, since it seemed to have no eyes she could locate. She tracked its movement patterns for 5 days. She noted when it came closer and when it pulled back. She noticed it never approached when the fire was burning high, but it came closer when the fire was low or dead. She made the fire a priority. But on day 22, it charged. It came at night, fast and low, making no sound at all until it was 20 meters from the shelter, and then making a sound like a wall of noise, a resonant boom that she felt in her chest. Mara came out of sleep instantly, combat trained, already moving before her conscious mind had caught up. She grabbed a length of hull plating, leaning against the shelter wall, and started hitting it as hard as she could with a fist-sized rock, over and over, making a clang and crash and racket that split the night air. She screamed at the same time, not from fear, but deliberately, as loud as she could push her voice, standing as tall as she could stand, making herself as large and as loud as any creature on this moon. The stalker stopped. It was 15 meters away, and it stopped. She kept hitting the plate and kept screaming, and it backed up. 1 step, 2 steps, and then it turned and disappeared into the trees, and did not come back that night. She stood in the rain for a moment, breathing hard, plate in one hand, rock in the other. Then she turned around. Ven was standing in the shelter doorway, staring at her. His ears were fully extended, and his eyes were wider than she had ever seen them. She had scared him almost as much as she had scared the stalker. She could see that, so she lowered the plate and took a breath, and made the small, slow hand sign they had developed for safe or okay. He did not move for a moment. Then he stepped forward, slowly, and reached up with those 6 gray fingers and touched the bracelet he had started weaving that week out of long jungle fibers. It was not finished yet, just a beginning. He held it out to her. She took it. She had no idea what it meant in his culture. She would not learn that for months, but she put it on her wrist over her splint and nodded, and he did the head tilt, and they went back inside out of the rain. On day 19, before all of that, Ven had gotten sick. A parasite, she thought, something from an insect bite on his ankle that had swollen and gone hot, and made him feverish and too weak to stand. She had been awake for 72 hours before she found the plant that fixed it. A low-growing thing with silver-gray leaves that Ven had once pointed to and touched to his own neck, in a gesture she had interpreted as something like medicine or good for body. She had no way to process it properly, no lab, no testing equipment, so she boiled it in the cooking vessel 3 times, filtered it through a torn piece of uniform fabric, boiled it again, and then sat beside Ven and made him drink it slowly. She did not know if it would work. She did not allow herself to think about what she would do if it did not work. By the following morning, his fever had broken. She sat with her back against the shelter wall and did not speak or move for about 10 minutes, which was all the recovery time she allowed herself. Then she went back to work on the traps. By day 30, they had a routine, a real one, built from necessity and failure and small adjustments and the gradual, careful learning of each other's limits. Mara would not have called it comfort. The word felt too soft for what it actually was. But it was something. Day 30 looked like this. They woke at first light, checked the traps, gathered food, maintained the shelter, and in the late afternoon when the heat was worst, they sat in the shade and worked on their language together. He showed her the symbols his people used, intricate, fractal-like patterns drawn in mud or ash that represented not just words, but ideas. She showed him English letters and how they built into sounds and sounds into words. It was slow. It was, sometimes, funny, genuinely funny, in the way that 2 people making sounds at each other and failing completely could be funny. He said one of her words back to her wrong, in a way that made her laugh, and the sound of her laugh surprised him, and then something in his face shifted, and he made his own version of the sound, a sort of rapid, quiet clicking that she came to understand was the therapy equivalent of laughter. That happened on day 26. It was a good day. She still counted it as one of the better days, much later, when there were nearly 500 marks on the wall. One morning, the sky above the canopy turned from pale gray to deep green, and by midday, the wind had picked up to the point where the trees were leaning hard, and by evening, the rain was not rain anymore. It was a wall of water and pressure that tore leaves off branches and turned the ground into a river. Mara had noticed the shift in barometric pressure 3 days before it arrived. She had a basic weather sensor salvaged from the wreck. But she had not understood how large the system was until it hit. The shelter held for 6 hours, and then the roof went. She grabbed the most important salvage supplies in the dark and the rain, their eyes stinging from the chemical bite of the downpour. She grabbed Ven's wrist with her good hand and she ran. She had marked the cave entrance on her mental map 11 days earlier while scouting the ridge to the north. A narrow opening in a rock face, low to the ground, wide enough for two, leading down into darkness she had not yet explored. She had thought at the time that it might be useful. She had not expected to be running for it in the middle of the night in a monster storm with a gray alien child in tow. They made it. They pressed through the narrow entrance and dropped into the dark, and the sound of the storm above them muffled immediately, like someone had put a hand over the speaker on a very loud device. Mara activated the light from her salvaged emergency torch and swept it around. The cave opened up quickly. The entrance tunnel was narrow and low, but after 20 meters it widened into a chamber the size of a large room, with a ceiling high enough to stand under and a floor of smooth, dry stone. Further in, she could already see the faint blue-green glow of bioluminescent organisms growing on the cave walls. Living light, steady and soft, enough to see by if you let your eyes adjust. She turned off the torch to save the power. The soft glow of the cave light, with the storm raging somewhere above them, and the air down here warm and damp and still. Mara Osei looked at Ven, and Ven looked at Mara Osei. His ears were up, which she now knew meant he was alert and paying close attention, but not frightened. She held up her fingers, 10, then 10 again, then 10 again, counting out a question with her hands, asking how many days before the storm ends. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment, the way he did when he was thinking hard. Then he held up all his fingers, both hands 6 and 6, and did it again, and again, and again, 72 fingers. She stared at him. He did it again, calmly, to make sure she had understood. 72 days. She sat down on the cave floor. He sat down beside her. And that was how the long dark began. The caves turned out to be extraordinary. What had looked like a single chamber from the entrance was actually the beginning of a network. Tunnels and rooms and underground rivers and vast hollow spaces that went deeper and wider than either of them had expected. Ven was the one who pushed them to explore it. This surprised Mara at first, because in her mental picture of his species, he was cautious and quiet, and not given to curiosity-driven risk. But the Thorathi were navigators and explorers at their core, and even a child of 8 felt the pull of an unknown space. He moved through the dark tunnels with his hand trailing the wall, his head tilted, making small sounds that she came to understand were him building a sound map in his head. He could tell the size of a space by the way small sounds bounced back to him. She stayed close and carried the torch. Together they mapped the cave network over the first 2 weeks. She drew it with a piece of ash charcoal on a smooth section of cave wall, a rough diagram that grew more detailed every day as they discovered new sections. He remembered every turn and every marker perfectly without writing anything down. She added drawings and labels for the benefit of her own much less perfect human memory. The network had underground water, a slow stream of it, coming from a deeper level and running along a channel that had been worn smooth over what must have been thousands of years. It had food, cave organisms small and strange, plus a type of mushroom-like growth that Ven identified as safe, and that tasted like almost nothing, but provided something. And it had warmth. Deep in the cave where the network opened into its largest chamber, a space so big Mara's torch could not reach the far wall, there was a thermal vent in the floor, a crack in the rock through which heat rose steadily from somewhere far below. She stood over it for a long time, feeling the warmth come up through her boots. Her mind was already doing things with that heat, asking questions, making calculations, beginning to construct possibilities. She filed it away and said nothing yet. The long dark was also the time they really learned to talk. Their pidgin language, the hybrid thing they had been building from gestures and sound clicks and English words and Tharathi expressions and invented signs, grew faster in those months than it had in all the weeks before. This was partly because they had nothing else to do in the evenings but sit in the blue-green cave light and talk. Ven told her about his people. He told her about the great library ships, massive Tharathi vessels that carried not just navigation data, but the recorded observations of 1,000 years of exploration, every star and moon and strange creature noted and stored. He told her about the Tharathi philosophy of Verath, a word he had to explain slowly and several times, which meant something like witnessing without changing. The idea that the right way to move through the universe was to observe and record without leaving damage behind. He said his people did not fight wars. Mara asked why. He said that his people had fought wars long ago, and they had been very good at them, and the results had been so terrible that they had decided, as a civilization, never to do it again. She thought about that for a while. Then she told him about humans. She was honest. She did not try to make humans sound better than they were. She told him that humans were loud and often foolish, that they had been fighting each other since before they had any reason to, that they damaged things, including their own home planet, that they were impulsive and short-sighted and sometimes selfish in ways that were almost impressive in their scale. But, she said, they also built things from nothing. They also crossed oceans on wooden boats, with no guarantee of what was on the other side. The other side. They also went to the moon with computers less powerful than a basic wristwatch. They also wrote music, and painted walls, and created stories about imaginary people, and felt genuine emotions about those imaginary people. And when someone was in trouble, something in them lit up, something old and stubborn and not always rational, and they moved toward the trouble instead of away from it. Ven was quiet for a while. Then he asked, in their pidgin, careful and deliberate, why you did not leave me in the wreck. She thought about the question. She said, I did not think about it. That is what I mean. She did not have an answer for that. So she said nothing, and they sat in the cave light together, and the thermal vent breathed warmth up through the floor. There was a blind predator in the caves. She discovered it on day 63, a long, pale creature that moved along the cave walls and hunted by sensing heat and vibration. It was large, larger than the stalker outside, and it moved quickly when it moved, but it spent most of its time completely still, which was the most dangerous thing about it. Mara studied it for 3 weeks before she was comfortable moving through the sections of the cave it used. She learned that it did not pursue prey into the lit sections. The bioluminescence seemed to bother it in some way, and she learned that it responded to sudden noise by retreating, not charging. She added its territory to her cave map, and added notes on how to move through it safely. Slow steps, no. Vibration, stay in the lit areas when possible. Then watched her make the map, and on day 80, began helping her add detail to it. His spatial memory was extraordinary, and he corrected 3 errors she had not known were there. She looked at his corrections, and looked at him. He did the head tilt. She said, good. He said, good. On day 147, Ven got sick again. It was worse this time, a different thing, something deeper, something that made him shake, and made his skin go from pale gray to almost white, and made his eyes lose their focus. Mara went through everything she had salvaged, everything she knew, everything she had observed. She needed the ship's medical AI core. She had seen it in the wreck on day 1, and had noted its location, a sealed unit, protected in a crash-rated housing, designed to survive exactly the kind of impact the Cassidy's Reach had endured. The wreck was 12 kilometers away, through jungle that was still being raked by the tail end of the storm season. She looked at Ven. She looked at the cave entrance. She left him with water and the warmth of the thermal vent, and as much food as she could arrange within reach, and she went. The walk took 2 days each way. She moved through rain and mud, and past the territories of things that would have killed her if she had been slower or less careful. She reached the wreck and tore the medical AI core out of the hull with her hands and a piece of bent metal strut. She carried it back. When she arrived at the cave entrance, she was soaking, and her bad arm was aching from the strain of the carrying, and she had not slept properly in 4 days, and she walked straight to where Ven was lying, and set the core down beside him, and then sat against the cave wall, and was asleep before she could say a single word. 18 hours. When she woke up, Ven was sitting beside her, upright, his eyes clear, the color back in his skin. The medical AI was running beside him, its small diagnostic screen lit green. He looked at her. She looked at him. He held up the bracelet on her wrist, the one he had given her on day 22, which she had never taken off even when she slept, and he touched it gently. She understood now what the bracelet meant. He had told her weeks ago. It was the Tharathi gesture for, "You are worth protecting." He held it up to show it to her, because he had no other way to say what he was trying to say. She nodded. On day 200, she made her 200th tally mark on the cave wall, and stepped back to look at them all. 200 thin lines, scratched one each morning, every single morning, without fail. Then stood beside her, and counted them quietly in Tharathi, under his breath, for a long time. Then he looked at her, and in their pidgin, slowly, he said, "You always believed we would be found?" She did not answer right away. She looked at the marks too. Then she said, "Yes, always, every day." He looked at the wall again. His ears were up all the way, fully extended. She had learned that this meant he was feeling something large, something that did not fit easily into small words. She did not try to find words for it either. They just stood there together, and counted the marks, and the number was 200, and the number was not 500 yet, but it would be. The idea came to Mara on day 201. She was sitting beside the thermal vent in the big chamber, watching the heat shimmer in the air above the crack in the rock. And her mind was doing the thing it always did when she gave it enough quiet. It was building something. She needed a signal transmitter. She had nothing close to a signal transmitter. But she had a thermal vent, which meant she had a consistent and significant power source. She had the medical AI core, which contained a processing unit and a memory array and components she could repurpose. She had hundreds of meters of salvaged wire from the crash site. She had mineral deposits in the cave walls that Ven had identified, and that her engineering instinct told her could be shaped into something useful. And she had 201 days of survival experience that had taught her, beyond any remaining doubt, that almost anything could be built from almost nothing, if you were willing to be patient and creative and wrong a lot of times before you were right. She explained the idea to Ven. It took a long time. She had to draw pictures in the ash and use their pidgin language to its absolute limit, and act out concepts her hands alone could not carry. But Ven followed her with the intensity he brought to everything she had not expected from him, and when she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Complicated." She said, "Yes." He said, "Possible?" She looked at the thermal vent. She looked at the AI core. She looked at the walls of the cave. She said, "I think so." He said, "Then we start." The build took 217 days. The first 30 days were a complete failure. She built a rough power converter from salvaged components and mineral-packed casings that Ven helped shape, ran a line from the vent to the converter, and the whole thing shorted out in a flash of heat and a smell of burning that lingered in the cave for a week. She disassembled it and started again. The second attempt lasted 4 seconds before a connection failed. The third attempt did not even get that far. After the fifth failure, she sat on the cave floor with components scattered around her, and her good hand pressed over her eyes. And she was quiet for a very long time. Then sat down across from her and waited. He was good at waiting, better than anyone she had ever met. He could sit perfectly still for long stretches and simply be present, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. And she had come to value this about him more than almost anything else. After a while she took her hand away from her eyes and started picking up components again. He picked up the ones on his side and handed them back to her, one by one, in the order she had laid them out. Told him the order, but he had memorized it from watching her work, and he handed them back perfectly. She stopped and looked at him. He did the head tilt. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Start again." She said, "Start again." Then became her engineer's apprentice over those months, and he was better at it than she had any right to expect. His pattern memory was almost perfect. Once she showed him a circuit layout, he could reproduce it from memory, every single time, which meant that when she needed to test a design multiple times, she did not have to rebuild the layout from scratch herself. She only had to check his work, and he was almost never wrong. He was also precise with his hands in a way that her human fingers were not. Those 6 long gray fingers could work in smaller spaces, and at finer detail than she could manage. And some of the connections that had been failing were failing because she was not able to make them tight enough with her own hands. He fixed that. She did the creative thinking, the improvising, the problem-solving, the looking at a pile of wrong materials and figuring out how to make them right. And he did the execution, and between the two of them, they were better than either of them would have been alone. They built the transmitter in sections. Power stage first, then the conversion array, then the antenna assembly, which was the hardest part because it needed height, and they had to route wire up through a natural shaft in the cave ceiling that connected to the surface, which took 2 weeks of careful work and 3 trips Mara made alone to the surface to fix anchoring points. During the months of building, they also read to each other. The medical AI Pore had a small library stored in its secondary memory. Not a large one, but enough. Technical manuals and health reference guides, and unexpectedly, a collection of short stories from a dozen different human authors that someone on the original crew had saved to the unit. Mara read these aloud to Ven in the evenings. He listened with his full body, ears up, head slightly tilted, completely still. He asked questions after each story, careful questions that cut to the center of the story in ways that surprised her, because he focused not on the plot, but on why the people in the story made the choices they made. She told him about Earth, about oceans and cities and music, and the strange human habit of creating sports, which he found deeply puzzling and then, slowly, genuinely interesting. He told her about the great Therathi library ships, vessels that carried not just information, but the recorded observations of explorers going back 1,000 years. Every discovered world noted and described in the fractal pattern notation of his people. He said his people did not just map stars, they mapped the feeling of a place, the quality of light on a new world, the sounds an alien environment made at dawn. She said, "That is beautiful." He said, carefully, in English, "Yes, we think so." Day 310 was the worst day. She had been sleeping lightly, the way she always slept now, surface level, alert, when she heard something above the cave. A sound, high and rhythmic, something mechanical. She was on her feet and moving before she was fully awake, grabbing the last working emergency flare from her kit, running for the surface shaft, pulling herself up into the night air above the cave, and firing the flare into the dark sky. It burned red and bright against the black. She screamed upward. She waved her arms. She kept screaming. The sound faded. The sky was empty. She stood there in the dark and the cooling night air, and the flare burned down and went out. It had been a natural atmospheric phenomenon. Understood that, when her mind caught up with her body, some kind of plasma resonance in the upper atmosphere that the moon produced occasionally, which she had documented in her notes and then apparently forgotten when she was half asleep and desperate. She stood there for a moment. Then she sat down in the dirt at the cave entrance, and she cried. Not quietly, not the controlled, compressed kind of emotion management she had been practicing for 310 days. She cried fully, with noise, with her face in her hands, with the kind of release that 310 days of held-together hope produces when it finally finds a crack to come through. She did not hear Ven come up behind her. She only knew he was there when she felt his hand on her shoulder. That careful six-fingered touch, light and steady. He did not speak. He did not say it would be okay. He did not tell her to stop, or offer her a solution, or try to explain away what she was feeling. He just sat down beside her and stayed. And she cried, and he stayed, and the night was dark around them. When it was finished, she wiped her face and breathed and sat in the quiet for a while. Then she said, "Sorry." He said, "No." She looked at him. He said, in English, slow and clear, "No, sorry. You are allowed." She breathed again. Then she got up, went back down into the cave, lay down, and slept. The next morning she got up and went back to work on the transmitter. On day 418, they powered it on. The moment the circuit closed, and the components all held, and the power from the thermal vent flowed through the conversion array and into the antenna, Mara felt something in her chest that she did not have a word for. A combination of fear and hope, and the particular terror of a person who has worked toward a single thing for so long that the moment of arrival is almost too large to stand inside. The transmitter ran. 1 second, 5 seconds, the signal was broadcasting. She could see it in the readout on the repurposed AI screen. It was fragmented and incomplete and nothing like the clean distress beacon she would have chosen. But it was artificial, and it was signal, and it was going out into space. 7 seconds, 9 seconds, 10. On the 11th second, the power component failed. A small explosion of heat and a snap of sound, and the transmitter went dead, and the readout went blank. Silence. Mara stared at the dead unit for a moment. Ven was very still beside her. Then he said, "Maybe nobody heard." She looked at the failed component. She was already assessing it, already seeing what had burned out and what could be rebuilt. She said, "In search and rescue, a fragment is enough. A ghost signal, a blip. The right person will follow it." She picked up the burned component. She said, "You just have to make noise. Someone is always listening." She began taking it apart to rebuild it. Then watched her for a moment. Then he picked up the tools on his side and began preparing the components she would need next. They worked in the warm cave light, the bioluminescence soft and blue-green around them, the thermal vent breathing steadily below, and neither of them spoke, but the silence was not empty. It was the silence of two people who have run out of doubt. On day 420, the stalker came back. She saw it at the cave entrance in the low evening light. It was larger than she remembered, and behind it were 3 smaller versions of itself, young ones, following in the same deliberate and silent way the parent moved. It stopped at the cave entrance. It was 15 meters away. Mara stood at the entrance and did not move and did not shout. She just stood there. After a long moment, the stalker turned away from the cave and led its young ones back into the trees. Then came to stand beside her. He said, "I think it is afraid of you." She said, "Good." She said it quietly, without looking away from the trees where it had disappeared. She added her 420th tally mark to the cave wall that night. 80 marks to go. She was not afraid of 80. Nobody was supposed to be listening. The signal, 11 seconds of fragmented, incomplete distress data, human frequency codes mixed with Tharathi navigational pings, was the kind of transmission that most automated relay systems would have flagged as noise and discarded. But there was a Galactic Survey collective relay buoy drifting in the outer edge of the Kareth system, and the buoy was old. And old buoys had less precise filtering than new ones, and this one passed the strange little signal forward to the nearest station instead of throwing it away. At the station, it sat in a queue for 11 days. Then a technician named Soreth, a tired, methodical Delvari who had been reviewing signal logs for 6 years and had never found anything interesting, pulled it up because the file size was unusual. She listened to it twice. Then she sat up very straight and ran the frequency analysis again. Human distress codes were one thing, were UNAF ships all over this region, and a distress signal from one was serious but not impossible. But the Tharathi navigational ping woven through the human signal was something else entirely. Tharathi navigation pings had a specific encrypted signature that identified the ship of origin, and this one identified a vessel that had been reported missing 8 months ago, a small personal scout ship that had been carrying a Tharathi navigation scholar and his family. Human distress, Tharathi registration, same signal, from an uncharted moon that was not supposed to have anything on it at all. Soreth filed an emergency cross-species report and went home and did not sleep. The diplomacy took time. UNAF and the Tharathi Navigational Conclave had a polite and cooperative relationship, but they had never needed to mount a joint rescue operation before, because their people had never been stranded together before, and there was a certain amount of careful negotiation required before a joint vessel could be assembled and crewed and dispatched. This took 31 days. The combined rescue ship, a UNAF long-range search vessel with a Tharathi crew compartment added in a modification that the shipwrights on both sides considered unusual, dropped into orbit above Kareth 9 on day 499. The rescue team lead was Commander Jonas Reyes of the UNAF Search and Recovery Division, a quiet man with extensive experience in difficult extractions. He looked at the telemetry data from the moon's surface and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "Somebody down there has been very busy." The surface scan showed a cave system with deliberate modifications, walls mapped and marked, a shaft running from a deep chamber to the surface with wire routed through it, a thermal vent with evidence of engineered equipment around it, and at the crash site 12 kilometers away, evidence of careful, repeated salvage over a very long period. He also found the transmitter. What was left of it, the burned-out components and the rebuilt sections, and the partially completed secondary unit, was sitting in the cave's main chamber. And even damaged, it was identifiable as a deliberately constructed signal device, built from materials that had no business being a signal device. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, to nobody in particular, "What kind of person builds?" Mara heard the rescue shuttle before she saw it. She was inside the cave, working on the second transmitter rebuild, day 499, 1 mark away from 500, when a vibration came through the rock that was different from anything the cave had produced before. She stopped working. Then, across from her, went still. They looked at each other. She said, "Do you hear that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That is not the cave." He said, "No, it is not." She was already moving, already pulling on her jacket, grabbing her pack on instinct. She went through the cave tunnel and up the surface shaft, and came out into the open air, under the pale sky of Kareth 9. And there it was. A ship. Not large, a shuttle, blocky and functional, descending in a controlled burn. Its lights blinking white and red, its thrusters kicking up a storm of leaves and debris, as it came down in the clearing, 300 meters from the cave entrance. Mara stood in the open air and watched it land. She did not cheer, she did not cry. She stood very still with the wind from the landing jets pushing against her face, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated for any single emotion to cover. Then she turned around and walked back to the cave entrance. She went back inside. She picked up her pack properly, organized it the right way, the way she always packed it, the way she had trained herself to pack it, even back in the first weeks when she had nothing to put in it. She slung it over her shoulder. She looked at the cave one last time, the tally marks on the wall, 500 of them now, because she had made the last one this morning. The maps drawn in ash and charcoal, the cave light, still soft and blue-green, the same color it had been on the first night they ran in. From the storm. She breathed. Then she walked out. Ven was standing at the entrance, waiting for her. She had known he would be. She walked to where he was standing and paused, and she looked at him the way she had been looking at him for almost 500 days, with attention and care and the particular focus of a person who has been responsible for someone small in a large and dangerous place. She checked, the way she always checked, that he was okay, that he was steady, that he was ready. His ears were up. He was ready. She nodded forward. He moved first. She walked behind him and slightly to his left, the same position she had taken since day 3, the one that put her between him and the direction most likely to produce a threat, and they walked together across the open ground toward the landed shuttle. HR. Commander Reyes came down the ramp with 2 crew members and stopped when he saw them. He had read the files. He knew what to expect. But reading a file and seeing Captain Mara Osei walking out of the alien jungle with a Tharathi child beside her, both of them moving like people who owned the ground they were standing on, were 2 very different experiences. He recovered quickly. He crossed the distance and stopped a respectful few meters away and said, "Captain Osei, I am Commander Jonas Reyes. We got your signal." She looked at him. She said, "The signal was 11 seconds. I was not sure it was enough." He said, "It was enough." She nodded. She said, "This is Ven. He is Tharathi, and he is 8 years old by his people's reckoning. And he does not always understand spoken English, but he understands tone and facial expression very well. So whatever expression your face is making right now, he is already reading it." Reyes looked at Ven. Ven looked at Reyes with his large dark eyes, ears fully extended. Reyes said carefully and clearly, "Hello, Ven. You are safe now." Ven looked at Mara. She made the small hand sign they had built together on day 8, the one that meant good or okay or this person can be trusted. He looked back at Reyes. He said in English, very clearly, "Hello." The medical bay on the rescue ship was white and clean and smelled of recycled air and antiseptic. And Mara sat on the exam table and answered the ship's doctor's questions in short, direct sentences, and let herself be checked without complaint. Through the observation window, she could see Ven in the next room. He was surrounded, for the first time in 500 days, by members of his own species. 2 Tharathi crew members from the navigational section who had come over from their compartment, the moment the news spread that there was a Tharathi child aboard. They were speaking to him in their own language, fluid and clicking and full of the ear movements, head tilts she had spent 500 days learning to read. And she could see from the look on his face that it was overwhelming, hearing his own language spoken fully and freely after so long. She watched through the window and felt something quiet and good move through her chest. A Thorathi counselor arrived and spoke gently to Ven, and then gestured toward a room further down the corridor. A private debriefing space, Mara guessed. Ven listened. Then he turned and looked through the observation window at Mara. He looked until she looked back at him. Then he crossed his arms, both sets of fingers pressed flat against his chest, which was the Thorathi gesture she had learned on day 60, which meant, "I see you," or "I know you are there," or, in the context they had built for it, something closer to, "I am not going anywhere." She crossed her own arms the same way. He held it for a moment. The counselor. But he went slowly, and he looked back twice, and she was still watching both times. The observation deck was a wide room at the back of the ship, with a curved viewport that showed the stars, and growing smaller by the minute, the pale green shape of Karath 9. Mara sat there alone for a while. She was not sure how long. She heard the soft sound of small feet on the deck behind her, and then Ven climbed up onto the bench beside her, and they both looked out at the moon getting smaller. They sat in silence. The stars moved slowly as the ship changed course. Then Ven said, in their pidgin language, the language that belonged to no one else, that no dictionary had ever listed, "What happens now?" She told him there would be official people, official questions, medical reviews, reports. His people would want to bring him home. Her people would want to debrief her. He asked, "Separated?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "On day 1, when I pulled you out from under that plate, I made a promise. Not out loud, not to anyone, but I made it. The promise was that I would get you home safe." She looked at him. She said, "I am not done yet." He looked at her. He said, "And after? When I am home safe?" She looked at the stars. She said, "Then I figure out the next thing." He was quiet. The moon was very small now, a small pale green dot among all the other points of light. Then Ven said it in English, fully, clearly, the best English sentence he had ever spoken, and he said it without looking away from the viewport. He said, "You always do." 2 years after the rescue, the Thorathi Navigational Conclave and UNAF jointly created a new diplomatic position that had never existed before. The position was called Human Liaison to the Navigational Conclave. It had never existed because there had never been a reason for it. There was a reason for it now. Captain Mara Osei, formerly of the Cassidy's Reach, accepted the position. She reported to the Conclave's first session wearing her uniform and the jungle fiber bracelet on her left wrist that she had never taken off. Not once. Not in 500 days on Karath 9, and not in 2 years since. In the Conclave's formal record of the survival event, a document otherwise written in the precise and measured language of people who had been cataloging the universe for 1,000 years, there was a single line that someone had added at the end, and nobody had removed it, and nobody ever did. The line read, "Survival was deemed statistically implausible. They survived anyway."